Okay, as they're walking on, Jaime Nack of 3 Squares. You've heard her already on stage, giving a quite compelling breakdown of the SEC proposals, among other things. Russell Sprole here of Virta Ventures, a local Sun Valley person who is a venture capitalist in climate after being an entrepreneur in climate for many, many years, like 15 or 20 years. And finally, Andrew Wishnia, who is in the private sector, but only for the last 2 weeks with Cityfi, and for about a decade before, several big stints before that, he's been at the Department of Transportation, most recently as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy. And one of the things Andrew did when he was there was play a big role both in the infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and the IRA. So maybe I could start with you. You just heard the last question I asked Matt, are we doing enough? And, maybe that's not what I need to ask you, but you saw the sort of, what's the cliche, pie being baked? No, there's another cliche. There's some kind of
sausage
cooking.
Being made.
The sausage, that's a good one. It's a sausage being made, and it wasn't easy, but amazing success that your administration had. So how do you characterize where we are in the response? I guess that's what I want you to talk about.
Well, thanks so much for being on the stage with you, and it's such an honor to be here with Matt and Jamie and Russell, and thanks to Amy for having us all. My sense is that after 14 years of spending time at the House of Representatives, the Senate, the White House, and then most recently the Department of Transportation, we did something historic. And by we, I mean all of us on stage, everyone out in the audience, and everyone listening in. We passed a historic, transformative, piece of legislation in the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law. But precisely to Matt's point, one of the reasons why I felt like it was time to pass the baton is not because there's not more critical work to do inside of the administration. There absolutely is, and there are stunning and impressive people inside the administration who will keep that train moving. But the opportunity now on the outside in the private sector to work with philanthropy, VCs, the public sector, the private sector, to be able to connect the dots and help leverage the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act to the highest and best use is critically important. And I think, a continuing thread that you've heard on the stage over the course of the past several days. My sense is that at this point, one thing we all need to recognize and do is that neither the Inflation Reduction Act or the bipartisan infrastructure law is self-executing. So that means that it's up to all of us to leverage these funds urgently, quickly, but also do so strategically. And there's extraordinary opportunity to leverage EV charging funds, solar funds for natural infrastructure, funds for transportation resilience, for infrastructure resilience, funds for wildlife. The definition of infrastructure, I think, is moving beneath our feet with the passage of this law and with the implementation. And so I think we need to be thinking creatively. We need to be working together, which is so helpful to have Amy convene us all here, because it's desperately urgent to do that work now, recognizing that the world is watching, and we have a tremendous challenge, but also a tremendous opportunity ahead for us.
A good set of things to say. Thank you. Jamie, you are interesting because you have perspective you work both with big companies as a consultant and also with a lot of startups. Yeah. So I guess the thing we really want to do with this panel is help give a sense of what's happening with deployment, with getting good technologies and systems deployed in the US in particular. So how do you see that going right now?
Yeah, I think policy matters, which is what Andrew just alluded to. And in terms of from the corporate lens, whether you're a listed company in the US or whether you're a startup or you're pre-IPO, these signals tell you that you're going in the right direction and business is open for you, right? So I talked about the SEC yesterday. All of the listed companies that we work with are preparing for that regulation, and it's elevated this to the board level, to the management level, and raised an awareness around, do we need to allocate more funds to these areas, right? from the startups or even the pre-IPO folks, they're not only seeing that investors have increased interest and activity, and I know Russell can speak a little bit to that, but I think when they see that the government is willing to put some skin in the game and that we're going to unlock some government funds, I think private investors are also stepping up, and we've been seeing more activity and more investment.
Really good. Well, Russell, you recently started this VC fund. You've already invested in 5 companies. I'm sure you're talking to a lot more. There was a lot of enthusiasm for climate tech investing, and then when interest rates started going up, the whole VC landscape started shifting. But characterize what you're seeing in the innovation front and deployment, and what you're most excited about right now or worried about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as you mentioned, there were a ton of funds raised, climate tech funds, over the past few years. That has slowed down for obvious reasons. But the amount of capital, the billions of dollars in capital that's out there, dry powder, to invest in early stage, mid stage, late stage companies is still immense. And I think will continue to grow, albeit a little slower than it was growing 18 months ago when money was free. The area that I'm most excited about, and we talk about kind of urgency of accessing these funds and deploying these technologies, is in the EV space. There's a lot of innovation going on with how do you make this experience better for the customer, and I'll give you a couple examples. No one's going to force you to buy an EV. These policies and these tax credits aren't forcing anyone to buy an EV.
They're just bribing you.
Slightly bribing you, but you want to make that experience really, really, really easy and simple. So one example is if you go to a car dealer today and you buy an EV, you want charging at your house. The car dealer's not going to do that. Maybe he'll tell you to call a local electrician. But one of the companies that I'm excited about is a company called Treehouse, and what they're doing is they are partnering with the car dealers. They're giving instant quotes on that charging, the cost of that charging, and then within a day or two, they're going and installing it. You don't have to call a local electrician. You don't have to worry about it. It's just going to be there, cheap, easy, fast, and integrated with the car buying process. And so it seems like a very little thing, but if you can make that part of the process simple and painless, that's gonna start the flywheel going with getting more EVs out there. And another example is a used EV marketplace, and how do you price these EVs? The mileage of a car is really important for an internal combustion engine, but it's really the battery health for an EV that's really important as to how you should price that. Completely different. That's not on the dashboard of a car. You actually have to go test the battery health. And so figuring out how to price that, coming up with new innovations and business models to do that, to make that easier, and just to make the process smoother so we can make it easier for customers, for dealers, and get these EVs out there as fast as possible.
Really good, and I'm glad you shifted us toward EVs, because I wanted to bring that up anyway. I think all of you probably have thoughts on that, but Andrew, you worked very hard on getting a lot of these provisions in place, and Matt, you in LA are thinking about how to electrify things in all kinds of new ways. So, and we have this very interesting recent news of GM, Ford, and probably Hyundai converging around the Tesla charging standard. So I guess anybody jump in, maybe Matt or Andrea can go back to telling how it happened, but do you think we are sort of getting to an inflection point on EV deployment and infrastructure deployment, and how do you see that landscape evolving right now?
Well, in 2018, my organization, LACY, launched something called the Transportation Electrification Partnership that set ambitious targets to achieve by the Olympics that are coming to Los Angeles in 2028. One of the targets we set was 80% of the cars that were going to be sold across our county would be electric by 2028, wow. Which would get to, based on our modeling, 30% of the cars on the road to be electric by 2028. People thought we were insane.
What's the percentage now roughly in LA, would you guess?
At the time, it was probably 5% of cars sold, maybe 3% statewide.
Okay.
Now, in California, we just eclipsed 20% of all cars sold are electric.
Wow.
And LA County, I think the number is a little higher. But because we were so audacious, people sort of would be able to point to it. But the reason why it mattered is we had the mayor, we had the county, we had automakers at the table, we had the State Air Resources Board. And then we saw a few things happen, which Andrew was a part of. But the president said, I want 50% of all the cars sold to be electric by 2030. The governor did a statewide executive order saying banning of internal combustion engines by 2035. But the thing I want to touch on for just a minute is in LA, we have two ports, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. 40% of the United States goods comes through those two ports and through the rest of the country. The diesel trucks and trains and the ships that move those goods are the greatest source of air pollution in Los Angeles. So that is the big challenge, is how do we electrify? I think we're making progress
Like
in the
the
light-duty
drayage,
cars,
the trucks that go
the
back
big
and
Class
forth,
A
right?
trucks.
Yeah.
So we have hundreds of those trucks, electric trucks on the road now. We need thousands. We have 20,000 trucks registered at the ports of LA and Long Beach. And Andrew and I would spend a lot of time talking about this when he was in the administration, about the cranes and the equipment and the trucks and all these things. But that is also enormous. It's not as visible when you think about electrification and transportation. You think about the cars. But just wanted to put that.
Well,
on the
real
table.
quickly, since you are in touch through your mayor's group with people all over the country, and California is an outlier on this. In fact, 20% of EV sales or more for LA. That's got to be the national top right now. Are you seeing similar interest in these other cities where you're in touch with people?
Well, you are seeing municipal fleets really begin to lead the way in a lot of cities, and you're seeing more. I mean, different markets are evolving at different paces. When Georgia had a state tax credit, they were selling a lot of EVs in Atlanta. But I think Andrew probably has some insights on how the movie.
I wanted to go to Andrew because it's interesting that you guys were talking a lot when you were in government, and I would think that somebody like him has got to have been a big asset for you because he's so practiced at working out the minutia that actually makes stuff work.
Yes.
Right? And is that, I mean, talk about that, maybe that process or anything else about this EV deployment, because you were one of the real champions and authors of that radical money shifting legislation.
Just to stay in Matt's time machine, in 2018, just 5 years ago, Congress hadn't introduced a single discretionary grant program for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Think about that. Right now we have $7.5 billion for charging infrastructure, not to mention charging infrastructure eligibility across the board for transit programs, for maritime programs, for airport electrification, across our modal administrations. But just 5 years ago, Congress introduced the very first piece of legislation, not even passed, introduced the very first piece of charging infrastructure legislation. So I know that there's so many challenges in front of us, but it's important to think about sort of where we started and where we are. And in just the period of 5 years, we've made so much progress. So to go back to your initial question, my sense is we're not necessarily at an inflection point when it comes to transportation electrification. I think we're already there. I think we're moving in that direction regardless. To me, the question is whether we're going to get there fast enough, whether we're going to get there equitably enough and get charging in underserved and overburdened areas, and whether we're going to supply these installations with American workers, and whether we're going to create good-paying American jobs. And I think those are the three priorities, in addition to all of the other administration priorities, that are really imbuing how we're installing electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We don't want to just install 500,000 chargers for the sake of installing them, but we want them to be good-paying jobs. We want them to be equitable. We don't want to widen the chasm between the haves and have-nots. We want to lessen that divide.
As a journalist, one of the things that I sort of like to think about are sort of signature facts that help me understand a whole kind of chain of events. And one is that I can't ever stop thinking about now that I'm really trying to think about climate, is how that in the 2016 presidential election, when Hillary and Trump were debating 3 times, the word climate was never even mentioned. And yet in this short period since then, we now have this phenomenal shift in government, and I give Biden enormous credit for that, and you. So another related piece of that is this whole industrial shift and industrial decarbonization. And I don't know exactly all the things that you work on with all of your big corporate clients, Jaime, but I guess it'd be interesting, when you think about innovation in particular and new steps that we're taking now that we wouldn't have taken very recently, what are you seeing among the big companies you talk to?
Yeah, I'll focus in on an industry perspective. So aviation. So we work with several airlines here in the U.S., Canada, and actually we helped a new airline launch in Australia. And one of the things that maybe you would have guessed after COVID with the downturn of air travel and airlines were really suffering, maybe you would have thought that they would have tried to not focus on the climate issue or the decarbonization issue because it represents a huge investment that needs to be made and a huge change of adoption of new technology, new thinking, sustainable aviation fuel, which has a huge price premium, et cetera. But that wasn't the case. So IATA, the International Travel Association, at their General Assembly the year following, the one that happened right after 2020, the topic of the General Assembly was climate and decarbonization. And so, this is an industry that all eyes are looking at them saying, we know that you're, like for the example, the footprint of this event, the biggest piece of the pie is air travel, right? And for a lot of companies, like even consulting firms like Accenture, Deloitte, Boston, they're making all of these investments in carbon removals, carbon offsets, because they fly a lot of people around the world. That's part of them doing their business. But the aviation industry said, we need to get on top of this. And so they started to build coalitions. Groups started to form focused on sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, because in order to ramp up production, those facilities are in the $1 to $2 billion range. And we have a SAF client, and they can take 4 or 5 years to just build a new facility.
Sustainable aviation fuel.
Sustainable aviation fuel. And the amount that we have today is what everyone in the industry refers to it as a thimble. So like a tiny cup of fuel, and everybody wants it because they want to say we're blending SAF, we're blending biofuels with Jet A fuel, and we're having a lower footprint, but it doesn't exist. We don't have production capability. So Biden administration and industry said we need to focus on this and started to pump money and attention to getting these deals funded.
What year was it that IATA meeting focused on this?
It was the one right after COVID, so it was either it was either 2020 or 2021.
But very recently.
Yes.
I mean, one interesting thing too is that I'm curious whether the pandemic shift towards virtual Zoom and Teams for everything was possibly really good for pushing the airlines, because now it's really clear that people don't always have to travel in ways they used to, as we're seeing even at this conference with a number of people zooming in. So do you think airlines that you work with are sort of feeling that pressure specifically?
So what's interesting is at the same time that they were focused on carbon and their footprint, they also were projecting out extreme growth in air travel. So when you think about the number of people who can afford to travel, that's increasing as people are moving to cities and wealth and those types of things. So they know that there will be an increase in air travel, but they also feel this pressure of needing to do something. So I'm not sure how many are aware, but France banned short-haul flights. So
right.
if there's a train or a rail ticket that can get you there in a couple of hours, then that's the option, and you can't take a flight. And so these types of things are starting to happen, which again helps reinforce the message.
Of course, on the other hand, and we're talking a lot about the US here, but it's good to bring international in. An Indian airline just ordered 500 jets, the biggest jet order in history. So we're going to see a lot of increase in flying. By the way, anybody who wants to jump in anytime, don't wait for me to ask some dumb question. But I did want to ask Russell, your role as a active VC and also as a longtime entrepreneur in this space. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing sort of on the horizon, some of the things that are exciting to you that are coming down the pike that maybe people here aren't familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, obviously AI is a very popular buzzword these days, and just kind of generative AI is something that has come up huge in the past just couple quarters. I think what I'm excited about is how we leverage that in climate tech.
Right.
And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface with that. So whether that's how we optimize the control of energy storage leveraging AI, how we help site for EV charging or whatever it is. There's the underlying AI infrastructure that is being built and that has come out in recent months, I think can kind of supercharge a lot of that and make it way cheaper to do, which will help us deploy much faster. And so that's one of the things I'm most excited about, that I think we will see companies literally being built in the next couple months that are starting to digest all these AI tools and build business models around them.
Yeah.
And it's moving so fast, which if we can use it in the right way is really exciting for the climate challenge.
Yeah, I want to come to you on this AI thing. But before I do, I'm a tech journalist, and this AI shift is obviously landscape altering for all of us, but especially for people like me. And now that I'm thinking about climate, I am realizing that software is going to be so critical for so many parts of the climate transition, way more than is generally discussed. And maybe I want to hear from you, Andrew, since you're nodding also. But one of the most cool things that has just been already discovered because of generative AI, which is really just one strand of a huge AI octopus, is that almost any software task can now be done 40 or 50% faster. Any software task. So if that's true and software is going to be critical in climate, that means we're going to be 40 or 50% faster getting the software we need for all these, changing the landscape of society. So anything on AI, I want to hear how you think about it in your work, and then maybe Andrew can chime in.
I mean, I think we called it machine-based learning for a long time. I mean, it's really how do we take and add more intelligence to the system. I will also say, back to the EV charging question, we started a EV charger maintenance workforce training program in 2019.
I love that you're doing those workforce things.
And so we had a woman come volunteer from EV Connect, which is a EVSE network provider, and EVSE is electric vehicle service equipment. Is that right? Did I got that right? And it's basically chargers. And what we learned is that when an EV charger's down, it's 80% of the time it's a non-electrical issue. Often Wi-Fi connection, the data logger's down. Or a software issue or a firmware issue. It's just, and then this woman, Camille Terry, ended up founding a company called Charger Help. Her and her co-founder, Yvette Ellis, have built a workforce across the country in charger maintenance. We had Vice President Kamala Harris come to our campus a few weeks ago, and Camille got to pitch her company and to the Vice President, and Yvette got to introduce the Vice President to the crowd. But more importantly, they're building the workforce and the software to be able to deploy technicians to diagnose and fix chargers. So we get this charging infrastructure deployed. We don't want people to experience downtime. We don't want them to experience uptime, it's flawless. So one of the things Andrew did was make sure 90% of uptime was part of the Inflation Reduction Act, and that we ensure that these chargers work and how we maintain them.
Really?
So there's a software aspect to the deployment of it. There's a software aspect to diagnosing what the problem is and how you're going to address it. Sometimes it could be something mechanical, but usually it's going to be a software type, IT type issue. So how can artificial intelligence play a role in predictive analytics? In diagnosing, and so you have preventative maintenance that is okay, well, these chargers really need a firmware upgrade. Let's not wait till they're down to then roll a truck or a technician.
And that's AI, a lot of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we'll see lots of ways that AI can be part of quickening the revolution.
Just to build off of what Matt said on EVs and then going to AI, one of the things I would want to commend folks listening in, to think about is the experience on the stage is unparalleled. Matt's experience is unparalleled, but there are so many stories out there that need to be told. And I think that the way that we talk about sort of the problem set is incredibly important. Since 2018, the state with the highest per capita installation of EV charging infrastructure is the state of Oklahoma. And my guess is that very few people would know that fact.
Oil state. Yeah.
But my sense is that in some cases, we need to have very candid conversations. And in some conversations, we need to meet people where they are. And whether it is, an oil-producing state like Oklahoma or an OEM center like the state of Alabama, which has Honda, Hyundai, Mercedes-Benz, major utilities, whether folks are coming from this climate change challenge from a jobs perspective or from an environment perspective, I think that there are occasions where we do need to meet people where they are. And that's a good pivot, I think, to this conversation about AI and digital construction more broadly. I think that this is a massive opportunity, just to zoom out. If we're talking about digital twinning, e-construction, there are so many opportunities to do.
Do people know what digital twins are? Could I just quickly define those?
Please. Yeah.
Digital twinning is when an industrial facility is basically replicated in software so that you can more or less test scenarios for almost anything that might happen, whether it's weather related or a supply chain issue, and anticipate it and therefore design the system better and also operate it much more efficiently. Sorry.
And it so happens to be the case that it's not only good for climate, it's good for safety outcomes, it's good for equity outcomes. And so if we can look, for those instances for win-win-wins, it's hard to start to demagogue those kinds of solutions.
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned Alabama, I wanted you to tell that story about Senator Shelby while you're at it.
While we're in the confidence of this audience.
This live stream to the world.
There are a lot of unheralded players in the development of, numerous provisions, and there were literally tens of thousands of stakeholders and folks who made the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Law and Inflation Reduction Act what it was. I think one of the anecdotes I was commenting on backstage is, sort of in the same realm of unheralded players. The members from Alabama were incredibly helpful in passing certain elements of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And I'll forego the particular member, but there was one member in particular who could have asked for, very difficult concessions, particularly when it came to EV charging infrastructure build out. But because he saw all of the jobs that were possible coming online in the state of Alabama, he was a huge champion behind the scenes. Obviously, politically, sort of tactically and strategically, it didn't make sense for him to, co-sponsor EV legislation. But I think it's those kinds of areas where if we can look for opportunities where we can give people a little space, where we can give people something in exchange, my sense is that that's where we kind of want to put the thumb on the scale.
Well, that connects to what we were hearing about yesterday, the promise that sort of built into the geographic diversity of deployment in the IRA, and the question of whether that's really going to affect how some of these red state Congress people think about climate action. I would just, Jamie, you have a very broad set of things you think of. I'm just curious if there's anything that you're thinking about in terms of particularly how we're moving forward at more speed than before. And it might even tie into what you're saying about the SEC, because you're so on top of that, just to share anything with this audience that we might need to know.
Yeah, I mean, I know you asked about things that excite us or innovation. So I also wear a second hat, which is I'm on the advisory board of several venture funds. And one fund, Soundwaves, it's Ashton Kutcher and Guy Osiris fund, has made a number of investments in some interesting companies. One that I'll mention is focused on biomaterials. So Styrofoam is still around. Everything that you get that needs to be protected from shipping, like a coffee maker, a Whirlpool washing machine, is packed in styrofoam, right? And that polystyrene goes straight to a landfill and sits there for thousands of years, right? And so one of the companies that we've invested in, Cruise Foam out of Santa Cruz, and they got this idea looking at surfboards and the foam in surfboards and said, how can we do this better? They're surfers. And created this new biomaterial made from, it's called chitin, which is essentially seafood waste. So think of shrimp shells. So the cartilage, the very strong, if you think of these shrimping operations or businesses, they have thousands, millions of pounds of these shrimp shells that just go to landfill as well. They take that material, this biomaterial, essentially
I
cartilage.
hope they wash it first.
Yeah. No smell. And they break it down and mix it with other biopolymers, starch, those types of things. And they've been able to create a foam that can stand up to styrofoam in all sorts of weight and pressure tests. And so it's a fascinating company, and I think they have a long way to go.
Well, it's a good example of the range of things that are happening, which I find so exciting in climate tech. Are they actually using it for surfboards already?
So they've made one, but they're really demoing with these big manufacturers of products, and
Yeah,
because of
'cause
extended,
that's a much bigger use.
exactly,
obviously.
and especially in Europe, extended producer responsibility, what you put out into the world. So if you're putting out a Whirlpool or a big item and it's packaged in foam, that foam is part of what you're putting out into the world.
Oh, damn, the time just keeps flying. Okay, we're over time, but I wanted to just, you mentioned workforce things several times, Matt, and this thing that worries me that I've heard a lot is this 1 million electrician shortage the U.S. has as we're trying to electrify everything. Is that something you are as worried about as some of the other commentators I've heard?
It is an enormous opportunity and need to invest in the future workforce and having trained electricians, particularly if we want them to be part of members of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers as apprentices, and then journeyman electricians, journeyperson electricians. It's enormously important, and we need a workforce that does the maintenance of all the things we're installing that are, because as we add in intelligence to everything that is, electrification of buildings and vehicles, we also need people who are focused on the internet.
But do you see signs that we're going to get
Yeah, I
there?
think so. I think we're going to have some pain points. I'm sure Andrew
So you're not-
thought about this when
You
he
don't
was
think it's a total, disaster?
Yeah, we're going to get there. We have to.
Okay, that's good. Russell, any final thoughts on anything that you were hoping you would say that I didn't ask you or we haven't heard about, or what you're
No.
doing that's interesting?
I think I'm good.
But good luck with your new fund, because it sounds very exciting.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you to you all. Thank you again to Amy.